Welcome. I'm Rachel Lessam, a research scientist at the Leonard Chanfield Research Institute at CJE Senior Life in Chicago. I hope you're all well and warm. It's snow flurries outside my window today. I'm so happy you all could join us. First, some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website after the webinar is over. Please stay muted until the Q&A. If questions do come up during the presentation, you can put them in the chat box. If you have any technical issues, please also put those in the chat box, and my colleague Christy Norick will answer them. Stay tuned for one final webinar in March on evaluation of research advisory boards. And oops, my mistake. And also stay tuned at the end for an evaluation of this webinar, which you will receive in the chat box and also in an email. This project is funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute as part of their initiative to accelerate tools and resources. So let's get started. We have divided the webinars in this series based on the timeline of a SAGE model board. Our first webinar was a general overview. The second webinar was about building the board through partnerships with providers, and today is about operating a SAGE model board. Our final webinar, as I said, will be about evaluating outcomes from your and process from your research advisory board. During today's seminar, you'll identify the capacities and needs of older adults receiving long-term services and supports. You'll recognize how to use strategies and techniques for building the capacity of board members to talk about research with researchers. You'll reflect on the capacity and needs of researchers for engaging with older adult advisory boards. And you'll recognize how to use strategies and techniques for facilitating discussions that provide robust and relevant input from older adults. So to get started, what do we mean by engaged research when we're talking about the SAGE model? We mean working collaboratively with or seeking knowledge from those who have a direct stake in your research to ensure that the research findings are translatable and lead to sustainable solutions to well-recognized problems. What is the SAGE model? For those of you who've been with us in our previous webinars, this slide should look familiar. It's a standing and ongoing research advisory board comprised of older adults receiving long-term services and supports who operate as SAGEs, offering guidance from the expertise of their lived experience, receiving long-term services and supports or similar populations. It's based on a partnership between an academic partner and an LTSS provider in an ongoing reciprocal relationship. And it's guided by the PCORI principles of engagement, which include reciprocal relationships, co-learning, partnership, trust, transparency, and honesty. In contrast to community-based participatory research, for example, these research advisory boards are not tied to a single project, but rather the members function as SAGEs, giving their input on multiple projects to multiple researchers. And this results in engaged research and greater research success. The SAGE model is a flexible approach that allows us to say that all research can be and should be engaged research. The goal of the SAGE model is to embed engagement into the entire research process from start to finish, whether that's the next topic of study, designing your study, refining your proposal and demonstrating to your funder that you have stakeholder input for relevance, addressing issues that arise during implementation, analyzing your data and results and interpreting them based on members' lived experiences, or dissemination strategies, because the ultimate goal of research is having it have real world implications. Now I'd like to pass the mic to my colleague, Rebecca Berman, who is also a research scientist here at the Leonard Chanfield Research Institute at CJE Senior Life, and she will walk us through training your new board members.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of what training can look like for members of a SAGE Model Research Advisory Board, starting with our learning objectives. Training members is all about building confidence. That's like the most important thing to start with. More so than even having a full understanding of research concepts, the goal is to really empower them to see themselves as being able to talk to researchers and to see their knowledge as worth sharing. Secondly, we want them to be comfortable talking about basic research ideas, familiarity with key terms, but also emphasizing that there are no wrong answers and it's okay to remind ourselves of what these terms mean. Thirdly, building trust in researchers is an important aspect of our learning goals. And we do this through repeated exposure to people who actually conduct research and our academic partners. And the facilitators also play key roles in creating a safe space to create that kind of trust. Finally, we want our members to be able to verbalize their expertise, which is their lived experience. That hinges on everything listed above. People have to believe they have something to offer at the table. And they also have to learn how to listen to researchers so that they can share relevant experiences to the topic at hand. Next slide, please. So what is in our training that we provide on our resources page? Well, there's three basic elements: research concepts, research process, and reviewing research. For concepts, we suggest starting by exploring members' views about the idea of research itself. That can really help in understanding their preconceptions and attitudes about research. And then we spend some time using basic research concepts such as research questions, study objectives, population, methods, intervention, outcomes, and patient-reported outcomes. For research process, there's an example of the slide that we use off to the right, but we use it in different ways in different contexts. And we use it to look at the whole process overall, but also to emphasize the complexity of that process and how long it takes and what's involved in each step. Thirdly, we do have some review criteria. We have 5 categories: what's significance, innovation, ethics, feasibility, and patient-centered. These are based on PCORI's review criteria for patient reviewers who sit on their panels, but we adapted many of the review questions by shortening and rewording them to maximize members' comfort with being able to engage in review discussions. So ultimately, the training never really ends. For instance, some boards meet between sessions with researchers to review published research, articles, and these provide excellent opportunities to also review key concepts. And ultimately, every meeting with a researcher can be used to review concepts and practice skills. Next slide, please. So what are the training strategies we use? Well, overall, our strategy is to promote iterative learning, reviewing concepts, practicing skills, repetition, reinforcement. We do this primarily through hands-on activities in our SAGE model boards. A primary activity off to the side is discussion. That is largely what we do, but we also engage members in storytelling. We use metaphors, analogies, ask for examples, engage in brainstorming exercises and prioritizing exercises, and exploring research ideas that they think of themselves. The second major method is using plain language throughout all of this. Definitions of terms, summaries of research, avoiding acronyms, things like that. The third element is to be brief, which Rachel will also talk about with regards to working with researchers. The SAGE resources webpage does have examples of our learning activities and facilitation guides and slides, as well as some sample products from the original Bureau SAGEs that members created as part of their learning. Next slide, please. So really the most important thing is this is a flexible model. We want people to take the materials that we provide and adapt them to train their own members. That means they might need to modify the content of the training to fit the needs of the members, thinking about things like, are board members comfortable with longer presentations? How do they feel about being tested on their knowledge? How quickly can they process information? What types of learning activities are most empowering or least intimidating? And if your board members have the interest and the fortitude to learn more, feel free to beef it up and add more things. You can add relevant examples that fit the focus of the board, that fit the experience of the members and the population they represent. You can supplement with other training resources. For example, the Alliance for Research in Chicagoland Communities has some really nice slide presentations and videos on topics such as developing a research question. And I know that some of you have asked in the prior evaluation forms, did members of our boards receive human subjects training? In the Bureau SAGES, we were unable to use human subjects training, such as City, for example. Members did not respond well to really lengthy presentations, and surveys were intimidating, and they were not comfortable with the idea of being tested. So instead, we raised ethical questions related to the protection of human subjects during hands-on experiences while actually reviewing studies. Those, and honing in with those principles of respect of persons, beneficence, and justice. Basically, you have to figure out what works for your board members. You have to listen to their comments, listen to their frustrations, observe body language. Not everybody speaks up. They may be intimidated. And also ask members what is working or not working in a non-threatening way that allows them to give meaningful, critical, and constructive feedback. So now I'm delighted to turn it over to Amy Eisenstein, who is our former research director and currently program officer at the Retirement Research Foundation. She conceived of the concept of the Bureau SAGES and also disseminating this model through the second project that we had, which is SAGES in Every Setting. So it's so wonderful to have you here today. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted and honored to be here today and hoping that I could bring some of these concepts that Rebecca is talking about to light. So if you could go to the next slide, please. To begin, I just want to tell you a little bit of how this training all came about and how we got started when working with the original Bureau of SAGES. In order to create our first advisory board, we had a long list of training methods and opportunities. As you can see here, we started with 4 formal retreats a year for all Bureau members. This brought researchers together with older adults as well as other stakeholders. In these sessions, we discussed things such as understanding patient-centered outcomes research, discussing member health stories, and learning the health research lingo. We also had monthly informal meetings just for the older adults involved. In these meetings, we did things like creating uniform bio sketches for all of the members, discussing priorities for comparative effectiveness research, developing our mission, vision, and values, as well as critiquing and providing input on research proposals. We also had periodic activities and homework assignments. These were activities for the Bureau members to participate in between formal retreats. These activities were intended to enrich the learning experiences and were often done in small groups or one-on-one with volunteer research coaches. And we also had an annual event for each membership group to share their findings and experiences with the broader community. The original training from the Bureau of SAGES was distilled down into several key sessions that were noted to include essential training elements. We also developed a set of optional refresher training sessions to be used as needed. Note that the existing and new members were trained and retrained together. From our experiences with our initial advisory board, we learned that this work was possible, and in fact, it worked well. By year 2, the SAGES were providing invaluable input to a variety of researchers. But we also realized that it worked well in this one setting. How can we make this happen in more places and in more places that didn't necessarily look the same or have the same resources? And that's when, like Dr. Berman mentioned, we took on the SAGES in Every Setting project. So next slide, please. First, I don't expect you to read all the details in this figure, but the idea is to show you the process we undertook in order to create some of these core resources and move the project forward. In the SAGES in Every Setting project, we took the training materials that were created from the Bureau of SAGES and worked to create a core set of documents that could be adapted and built on in order to be used by other research advisory boards to train their members. We started by facilitating a new advisory board for the project itself with members from a variety of settings representing diverse populations. We conducted stakeholder interviews and gained a wealth of feedback and input on all of our processes. And we worked heavily with our evaluator from the Bureau of SAGES to really understand what is needed for the training and how the training materials will function in various settings. Based on all that input, we developed guides for training new bureaus that highlighted the key elements needed for conducting the training. We then applied those materials in various settings and continued to evaluate and to learn from that work. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk you through one specific adaptation of the training materials to bring some of this to light. First, you can see here are images from some of our initial groups of sages. I'm going to tell you how we adapted the training materials for the mesulum sages. Their image is the one at the bottom of the screen. This is a group of patients with a recent diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia. So to begin, we kind of took in a snapshot of our resources. We knew the clinic frequently worked with master's level interns and had an ideal meeting space. We also knew that the cognitive status of the participants might be shifting. So for those reasons, as well as additional input from staff in the clinic, we decided to make this a time-limited bureau. We used the 8 standard facilitator guides from the original Bureau of Sages to create an 8-week program, which culminated in a session with a researcher at the end. In the aftermath, the clinic was able to continue meeting, and I believe also had several more meetings with researchers who were gaining input from them. We pulled in lots of tips and pointers that Dr. Berman highlighted, including some things like having coffee at every meeting and really focusing on spending time to develop trust and rapport and to listen to the needs of the participants and their interests. We had a student with us who recorded observations during the meetings in which she described most of the members as being engaged with their peers, attentive, and appeared to trust or respect the group. In addition, the clinical participant described the sages as a cohesive and energized group, and members expressed interest in the patient engagement framework and process. We really wanted to be hearing from observers throughout and make sure that we were doing this right. So the discussion guides led the sages through a variety of training activities. They learned about what research is and the importance of the experiential voice in research. The training exposed them to the idea of IRB by discussing various parts of the research process. They learned to think through the research process, to understand the various components to conducting research, and had an opportunity to consider some of the ethical dilemmas. They discussed their own views on various situations that arise. Toward the end of the 8 weeks, the facilitator led the sages through a process to develop their own research project. Flip to the next slide, please. This slide, I like looking at this slide. It shows we had a whiteboard in the classroom, so the facilitator was able to write things right up there and we could take a snapshot of it. This shows one of the exercises that led up to the development of this group's their own defined research project. During this training sessions, the sages were led through an activity where they started by discussing positive health experiences. Factors from those positive health stories were then translated into health outcomes. This is how they came up with this list of positive health outcomes. They wanted to see these outcomes replicated by research in their projects. This is what was important to them. Ultimately, when they tried to build their own research projects, some of the participants were confused by the process and disappointed that they weren't able to move their specific project forward and conduct the research. We learned from this experience and removed this component from the core training while maintaining some of the elements like this one here about defining their own research outcomes. The Mesulum Bureau members provided additional advice for other organizations that develop advisory boards. They suggested describing an advisory board as a community-oriented coming together of people who contribute meaningful, needed input to researchers. They felt that members need to be committed to regular meetings, but for convenience, meeting frequency and length should be considered. They highlighted that treating people with respect and demonstrating the value of their thoughts are critical elements for a positive experience. They felt that other advisory groups made up of older adults should promote open dialogue in a small group format that avoids an overly rigid agenda and instead facilitates expression of opinions and thoughts. These ideas were all brought forward and incorporated into future training guides. This is just one example of a group who took the training and successfully implemented it into a different setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That was a really great presentation. We appreciate you being here to share that with us. A SAGE model board doesn't exist, however, without research to respond to. So in our previous webinar, we discussed the characteristics needed for an academic partner to successfully build a board. And one of those was a department or university with a mission aligned with engaged research, engaging with the community about whom you are doing your research. Presenting researchers need not be from your department, although that's a good place to start. Any research that has a bearing on the lives of your board members is worth presenting and worth getting feedback on so that the results are applicable in the real world. So this may start with the gerontology department or an interdisciplinary center focused on aging, and you may do that just by word of mouth with your colleagues and personal connections, but you can also think more broadly. Psychology, sociology, anthropology, all those departments are probably obvious, but don't forget the vet school who may be looking into pets and social isolation, or bench scientists, urban planners, transportation school looking into age-friendly cities, the music school who may be doing a memory choir, technology, engineering, architecture, and design. They all may be working with older adults or doing research that impacts them. Personal connections and invitations are key. So have your elevator speech ready. Be prepared when meeting people at conferences or at other meetings to hear about their research and then say, hey, have you ever presented to a research advisory board? I think it would be really great to get some feedback. We have certainly recruited researchers from our meetings at GSA, through Twitter, and through word of mouth. Talk about it in different settings. And also you can use tools like the NIH Reporter and the PCORI Portfolio Search to find people at your academic institution during doing work with older adults using the older adult keyword. You'll likely find people you didn't even know were conducting research with older adults. So once you recruit your researchers, you need to prepare them. Why do you need to prepare researchers? We do presentations all the time. Well, even those who are in the field of aging may not regularly interact with or present to older adults, particularly those living in long-term care settings or who may have some functional limitations, or just folks who aren't researchers and need to speak in plain language. So we have prepared a suite of materials that we send to researchers before they present to our bureaus so that they can be ready. So the purpose of the preparation is to orient visiting researchers to the people, the process, and the setting. First of all, they need to understand Research Advisory Board member preferences and norms for individual needs. Some board members may speak English as a second language. They may have hearing loss or a limited vision. You need to help your researchers understand who the people are in this group to whom they will be presenting. Next, provide resources about communication tips and how to facilitate engagement when presenting. Inform them about advisory group procedures. As Hailee will mention later, some boards start out with a 5-minute check-in or may end with a 5-minute check-in or review of the purpose of the board. And finally, alert them to potential challenges or expectations in the setting. There may be a particular time that is best for staff and residents to meet. There may be online technology challenges if you're meeting online. There's the reality that not all members may show up to all meetings due to health issues or doctor's appointments or conflicting visits with family members. And of course, there are the current issues we're all facing that impact the ability of the board to meet due to COVID. And staff is really stretched thin in many of these places. There's a short supply of digital devices to go around, and older adults may need a lot of staff support to be able to sign in and access the meetings, and that researchers need to be prepared to be patient and wait for everybody to get signed in, or even to mute and unmute themselves. So one of the things that we provide is a PowerPoint template of about 4 slides to any visiting researchers. And researchers love PowerPoints, guilty as charged. But sometimes we need to remind ourselves to scale things down and focus on 1 or at most 2 salient points. These board members are not going to be critiquing a proposal from beginning to end. So what is the key issue and the key research question that you need feedback on? Next, explain your study very briefly and simply with one sentence on each of these, under each of these headings. And finally, ask one or two very specific questions. We also send researchers the review criteria. This has been useful, again, in the training, as both Rebecca and Amy have mentioned, but is helpful to a researcher to try and formulate the question that is going to give them the feedback that they need. Is the topic significant? Is the study innovative? Are there any ethical issues? Is it feasible in the setting that you're proposing? And overall, do you think it's patient-centered? And the way most of these meetings go, it's an hour-long meeting with a 10-minute presentation, and the remainder of the time is available for discussion and response to questions. And also reminding researchers that they may have to be prepared to stop during that presentation to define maybe unfamiliar terms or to answer some questions and clarifying questions from the board members themselves. Finally, we also send a 3.5-page document that include communication tips. This is the first page here. As you can see, it's adjusting to presenting to people with hearing loss and vision loss, and those are probably obvious examples that we think of in terms of age-related changes, but it also gives general advice for presenting to audiences of older adults, which may not be so common. Like asking your audience for feedback early in the presentation. Ask if they can hear you. Tell them to give you a signal if they can't hear you. Repeat any questions from the board members so that you can make sure everyone has heard it and to make sure that you're understanding what's being asked. Use large visual aids such as diagrams and pictures because those can also reduce the need for complex verbal descriptions, and make them large and easy to see. And then the final document that has been mentioned both in previous webinars and earlier in this webinar is the bio sketch. The bio sketch is filled out by all board members, by the staff who works at the board and the academic partners, but also by the guest researchers. So that helps gain the rapport and trust to have an open conversation with valuable input. And these bio sketches are non-threatening. They're not meant to intimidate people with their credentials. They look and find in a common ground, talking about perspectives on aging, as well as common interests and personal pastimes that really enhance the ability to have a fruitful conversation. It's also important to remind ourselves of the ethical dilemmas that may arise when researchers present to our groups. First of all, it's important to remind the researchers of the purpose of a SAGE model board, and that is to give advice on research, not to be a place to gather research itself. So this is not for data gathering, this is not a focus group, this is not something that you can use as data. Second, the SAGE model boards are not meant to be sites for recruitment into studies. This is a place where we value their expertise and their lived experience, but we also honor their commitment and honor their advice as experts, and we don't impose on their time extra on their time by providing them as potential participants, because there's also the possibility that having earned their trust, they may feel undue pressure to participate in a study when we would not want that to happen. Third is confidentiality. Of course, these SAGE model boards are not governed by an IRB. However, when you're talking from lived experience, that means you're sharing personal examples, and therefore that should be respected and not shared beyond the group. Using those examples to inform your research and make it better, of course, but keeping the personal part of it confidential. And finally, just respect for the SAGE members for the time they've committed, for being fellow humans, and the sort of values embedded in human subjects research of justice and respect. So all of this preparation is in order to support the research engagement skills once they are in the meeting. And the person who has prepared the researcher and communicated with the researcher may not be the person facilitating the conversation. So it's important for the researcher to be ready, and it's also key that during the meeting, the facilitator also supports the researcher engagement skills during the meeting. And now I'm gonna let Rebecca share with you how we facilitate meetings and go through our facilitation guides with you. Thank you. Rebecca?
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. So the last webinar, we covered the role of facilitators and training and their orientation to the SAGE model, becoming familiar with SAGE resources, knowing more about the setting, and observing advisory groups and practicing facilitation. Today, I want to talk more about what the key ingredients for effective facilitation are. And really, that's all about fostering bi-directional dialogue. That means validating each member's experiences, valuing and empowering all voices at the table, exploring differences in those voices and welcoming those differences, and avoiding leading questions. So you might have to reframe a review question, for example, instead of asking something like, is this survey question or is it appropriate? You might ask, what would older adults think this question means? Or instead of asking, do you think the study is relevant? You might ask, how is this study relevant? Finally, you have to, in addition, you have to resist the temptation to answer for members who might take more time to formulate their thoughts. It's silence is actually good. Being patient and waiting can lead to fruitful feedback. But do restate and confirm understanding of what was said. Facilitators that can do that help equalize the dialogue between members and researchers and foster mutual understanding. And Rachel has already mentioned a couple of the resources. We also share those with facilitators. And we do have some sample discussion prompts also that address issues related to managing group dynamics and staying on task. Next slide, please. So I do think staying on task is probably the biggest challenge for anyone who is facilitating a research advisory board. It is older adults become very comfortable sharing their experiences and they can have a lot to say. So the need is to focus this discussion, keep it narrow, especially for researchers, as Rachel mentioned. Contextualize the personal experiences. When someone shares a story or an example, reframe that experience in the context of the topic that's being discussed. Acknowledging complaints or concerns, and there will be some, especially for those who live in the facility that their board meets in, if they're in assisted living or a nursing home, or even at home actually with care. They might need to have an alternative venue for how to deal with their complaint or their concern, and a reminder that this group may not be the right place for that. However, you can also reframe the concern and fit it into a broader discussion of the research topic. Affirming the need for all voices to be included has already been mentioned, but I think it's important when you're facilitating a group to understand that some members can dominate and others take a longer time to speak up. So the members have to learn how to listen to each other. And a good facilitator needs to be able to gently ask the verbal person to allow room for others to contribute. And our sample discussion prompts do have some questions for how to deal with that. Reminders can become extremely important when things get off track. So that can be simply reminding of the topic, the question that was asked, or the focus of the study, but it can also be done at a broader level, reminding the group of their mission. The Bureau of SAGES developed their own mission and values statement and also their own vision. And you can see an example of the value statement off to the right there. So you could either start each meeting with brief mention of the mission, especially if there are new members on board, or you could revisit the group's values in the moment. So if there's a disagreement, you could reference the value of listening or mutual understanding and respect. These strategies for staying on task are also very useful for minimizing potential ethical dilemmas, which are likely to emerge among members. For example, excuse me, sorry, I lost my place. For example, members might bring up an issue that they have a conflict with another member, and that might not be such a comfortable position to be in. So having those tasks, those techniques in hand to be able to divert away from a disagreement would be very helpful. Members may develop such trust that they reveal personal experiences that they later regret or that make other people feel uncomfortable. And Rachel already talked about the importance of maintaining confidentiality and privacy. So being able to divert the conversation into something more general becomes very valuable at that point too. Also, sometimes something changes for a member. Their hearing gets worse, they have more difficulty speaking, they're tired due to a change in health, and they become frustrated that they can't participate like they used to. So they may need more support with engaging. So these are a few of the examples of how you might be able to minimize potential ethical dilemmas for the members. Next slide, please. Ultimately, it's all about accommodating and being flexible. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the universal design principles. There's one graphic off to the left that shows you what some of those principles are. Those need to be applied in all domains of this process. So for example, in the location, picking a location that minimizes barriers and maximizes participation. In our case, many of our bureaus meet where they live. Meetings, the appropriate length and time that accounts for energy levels, health and care schedules, staffing schedules, or other valued activities. Space, comfortable spaces that allow for people to move around if they have to be in a wheelchair, good tables and seating, and down to those details of where do you put the piece of paper handout that so someone can easily handle it and read it. Time, allowing extra time for those who need it to formulate their thoughts, or for those who don't speak English as a second, or they speak English as a second language, or for needs for simultaneous translation. Conditions and technology that foster inclusive engagement for anyone with any kind of challenge or impairment who's living with any kind of disability. Or for those in chronic pain, you may need some flexibility to allow caregivers to help them adjust their seat or get medication. And ultimately, it's all about patience. In our experience, when there were problems or challenges, our members were often more patient than the facilitators or the researchers who were presenting. So if the facilitator, a good facilitator, needs to have a matter-of-fact attitude when things don't really work out as planned. Next slide, please. So sometimes things don't work out as planned when there's online facilitation, as we are all well aware of now. So we need to identify the technology needs ahead of time, and especially when there's a researcher, knowing who will need to send the invitation for an online meeting. Sometimes we have groups who meet in person physically at where they reside, and the researcher is only the only person online. So you need to be aware of that ahead of time, and whoever's doing the technology needs to test it in the location that it will be used. I think the most critical thing is for everyone to be seen and heard. And I know a lot of the members of our research advisory boards really want to see the researcher as a big visual, but they also want to be able to see other members if they're all online. And Hailee will probably talk about that experience. Periodically, you have to ask, can you see, can you hear, can you read? When you're online, it is good to have both an on-site and online facilitator if you are working with a group of older adults that are meeting in person. And it always helps to have more than one facilitator online. Planning for how to provide technical support online, we all know about that. This is especially true for working with older adults in this kind of context. And work around technology problems without taking too much time from the meeting. And again, it's all about being calm and patient when there are technological challenges. And we do have some tips on that in our resource called Guidelines for Advisory Board Meetings. So with that said, I'd like to welcome Hailee Yoshizaki Gibbons, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Biomedical Humanities at Hiram College and a longtime facilitator of the Virtual Bureau of SAGES. She is going to share her experience with facilitating a virtual advisory board. Thank you, Hailee.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and welcome everyone. It's so wonderful to be a part of this really exciting webinar. Rachel, if you could move it to the next slide. So as Rebecca shared, I've been involved with this project since the original Bureau of SAGES, and one of the original chapters was solely virtual. We partnered with a nonprofit that runs a virtual senior center, which is an online platform where older adults can take classes, chat, build community. And we wanted to have this virtual option specifically for stay-at-home elders with disabilities who may have difficulty leaving home, navigating inaccessible transportation, having difficulty finding a place. So this is specifically for that population, which of course at the time we had no idea there would be a pandemic in 5 years, but I suppose things worked out in that regard. So for the first year of the project, we met virtually once a week. And since then, for the last 5 years, we have met bi-weekly. And so I'm going to be sharing some strategies for facilitation, specifically online, that were developed over this time period. Next slide, please. So I also want to share some vignettes and some examples of real life situations that happened. So one of the first strategies is to encourage multimodal forms of participation. One of the strengths of virtual facilitation is that many platforms like Zoom, for example, have multiple options in terms of people can participate via chat, people can use reaction buttons, sometimes there's breakout rooms. And although participants may need additional training to use these features, they can really enhance discussion. I also think it's very important to just be flexible and try to use the resources available to you. So as an example, one of our Bureau of Member Sages called me a few years ago and let me know that she had fallen. She had been placed in a nursing home for rehabilitation. And she was very upset because she knew we had a guest speaker coming to present research and she couldn't get like the internet set up. And so she felt there was just no way she'd be able to participate. So trying to be flexible, I basically just called her and put her on speakerphone. And it was a little challenging at times navigating Zoom and a phone, but it did end up working out and it allowed her to still listen to the presentation and participate meaningfully. So when you're doing that kind of troubleshooting, it's very important to just be flexible, think about what all your options are, and take advantage of all the resources you have. Next slide, please. Rebecca mentioned how important it is to focus the discussion. One strategy that I found very helpful for doing that was actually asking the researcher in advance what type of feedback would be most useful for them. So as an example, Dr. Tamara Heller at University of Illinois at Chicago presented to the Virtual Bureau of Sages in 2016. And she had a rather large study that she had already actually completed a significant portion of. So I asked her, given like the complexity of the study, what feedback would be most useful to her. And she said she really wanted feedback about dissemination. So when we targeted the feedback specifically to dissemination, the Bureau of Sages was not only able to learn about her research, but also really help her develop a more effective dissemination plan within that 1 hour session. As we all know, Zoom fatigue is very real. And I've just found that for the virtual Bureau of Sages, going beyond an hour really isn't feasible. And so targeting the feedback is an excellent way to make sure that you meet those time limits and still have a meaningful discussion. Next slide, please. Rebecca mentioned this as well, but our participants, our advisory board members are bringing so much life experience to the table. And so it is very easy to get off topic, and especially if something is, bothering them or very like personally relevant in their life. So just as an example, one of our advisory board members was 94 years old, and she was going through a really difficult time because her daughter, who was in her 70s, had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And so this particular member just kept returning to this topic, even if the research that was being presented by the researcher was seemingly completely unrelated. And that was because it was just really weighing on her. So she kept returning to it and getting off track. So what I did is I consistently affirmed her experience of, we understand you're worrying about your daughter. And then I would try to find ways to reconnect it to the topic, even if the connection was a loose connection. And then also ask a redirected question to her or to others to get everyone back on track. So it's very important, especially when we're dealing with people with so much lived experience, that we affirm them and value that lived experience while also trying to redirect it back to the issue or topic at hand. Next slide. Another really important thing is working intentionally to build community. The virtual Bureau of Sages members were not used to building friendships or being in community with people online. That's obviously not something that they grew up doing. So it's really important to try to foster that community. And the bio sketches that Amy mentioned earlier were one excellent way of doing this. They really loved those, and getting to know a little more about what people did in their past like careers and what their current interests were. So that was one really good strategy. But also just, thinking about occasionally doing icebreakers. Something that we implemented in the current virtual Bureau of Stages is we always use the first and sometimes the last 5 minutes of the session to check in with each other. So the members really like just asking how others are doing, like offering advice and support. At times, if they really like something, like feedback that someone gave to a researcher, they'll compliment or affirm them, which is really nice. But it really allows them to get to know each other better outside of the context of the Bureau, which then makes their relationships for sharing feedback stronger. And just as an example, one of our members recently broke her ankle. And so the Bureau has been consistently checking in with her about, how is she doing? How is she feeling? How's her physical therapy going? Has she tried this? So it's just a really nice way for them to connect with one another and build that community that is so necessary to have trust to share feedback with researchers. And it really helps foster this culture of, open discussion, sharing our lived experiences, checking in with one each other, caring and supporting one another. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to turn it back over to Rachel, and Rachel is going to play a video of one of our Bureau of Stages members, and I'll let her tell you a little more about him.
Thank you so much, Hailee, for that presentation. We'd like to close our formal presentation with this video of one of our SAGE members from the Lieberman Center. We selected David in particular because he is thoughtful and articulate, but the video also reflects the need to be patient and allow for the time and space for the Research Advisory Board members to respond. And I will play the video now. I will. There we go.
The Bureau of Sages is a group of people that are researching at the Lieberman Center issues that involve the elderly, such as the difficulties walking and how to maintain mobility. Issues of that sort are addressed. The Bureau has obtained grants that are used for issues that are brought up at meetings, are then allows presentation to homes for the elderly throughout the area of Chicago and sometimes elsewhere. We have given the researchers our issues that have come up in the course of residents living here at the Lieberman Center. The researchers have to understand some of the details of the motivation of the researcher's presentation. They have to create their talk in such a way that it will be understood by the residents in their center. The most challenging thing that I have done in the Bureau is to appreciate the difficult challenges of the residents, such as the discussions relating to CNAs at our institution and how to relate to them and how to relate them, how they should relate to us. It's a humbling experience to hear the stories that residents present to us. Some which can be very moving. But the group is a very friendly group, and the participation is heard from all.
Thank you. I apologize to if you weren't for some reason able to hear that video. I'm not entirely sure why, but we will make it available on our website. We're really excited you were able to take this hour with us, and we're really looking into digging into the final details of evaluating Research Advisory Board process and outcomes on March 11th. We are putting in the chat now a link to the evaluation form for today's webinar, also a link to the SAGE resource project page at CJE, where the recording of today's video will be available probably in about a week, as well as the video from the first two webinars. You can always feel free to contact me. There's my contact information. There's the survey link. Once again, we really appreciate any responses. And now with our remaining minutes, I'd love to open it up to questions from the group for everyone here. Let me see, I think there were some already. As I scroll up, or what kind of support do you provide to participants for them to be successful in virtual meetings? In-home support for those who do not have access for virtual technology. Hailee, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So pre-pandemic, we were able to go into people's homes and we would show them how the technology worked. The other nice thing is that by partnering with the Virtual Senior Center, they have a very accessible, easy to use platform. We are actually working on moving away from partnering with the Virtual Senior Center and just using Zoom. But at this point, the members are pretty familiar with how Zoom works. It is more challenging with the pandemic to provide support. What I've been doing is really just trying to talk people through things. I'll share my screen so they can see like what buttons I'm pushing. I'll describe what the buttons look like, where they are. But it is definitely more challenging not being able to go into people's homes, because previously, if one of the members contacted me and said like, I can't get my computer to work, I would just go visit her in her apartment, which is also just nice to see them in person, say hi. But unfortunately, that's no longer possible. So yeah, I've had to be a little more creative. I know there's also a number of guides that have come out. I know even Rebecca has made some resources on this, but basically just kind of plain language training guides so people understand better how to use certain online tools such as Zoom or Google Meet or other platforms.
And I think also Lindsay also had a question related to that about folks with visual impairment doing online participation. I don't know if Hailee, you've had experience with folks in your group.
Yes, I did also answer this in the chat, but I will answer it verbally
I'm
as
sorry.
well. Oh no, that's fine. I think it's helpful to do both. But yeah, so we did have a former member who had visual impairment. This person could still see some, but obviously you have to adjust it based on the person's visual abilities. But what I did was when we were sharing text on the screen, I would ensure everything was as large print or zoomed in as possible so that you could still get the meaning of what was being shared, but it was very large. And then I actually would also ask people to just raise their hands either physically or using like the raise your hand feature on Zoom. And that way I could call on people because our member with a visual impairment couldn't use visual cues to see like, oh, I could speak now, or here's who's going to speak next. So we did use like the, raise your hands and then I'll call on you. And then that way, like everyone, including the member with the visual impairment, knew when it was their turn to talk. And then the other thing we often did was use image description. So at times where, like, let's say a researcher put a graph up on the shared screen and it wasn't something that we could really zoom in and still understand the meaning of, that's when I would use, like image description to say like, oh, what's on the screen is a graph and the graph is showing X, Y, Z. And that way the person could still participate meaningfully.
And can I add in here?
Yeah, of course.
Also accommodated people in our, when we're meeting with them in person, but now we're meeting remotely sometimes with people at our nursing home because we couldn't go in there because of COVID. So there were some very wonderful staff who volunteered basically to troubleshoot and get people set up on their various digital devices, whether it was an iPad or a shared computer, and they just would make sure at the beginning of the meeting that everybody was logged in, that knew what to do, and help them out that way. And then also another good example is when we were meeting in person, we had one person who had profound hearing loss. And so we actually assigned her a volunteer scribe to actually type everything that was being said as it was being said. And I do know that there is a captioning feature in Zoom that could be used that way as well. It's not like automatic though. You have to have someone type it in, I believe. So that would be some different ways that we would accommodate online.
There are some plugins that you can get. I think Rev is one of the companies, but yeah, also having a staff member to type or volunteer as you go. Any other questions that I didn't? I think that was all I saw in the chat. If anyone else has another question.
I'd like to ask a question. This is Katrina Phelps.
Sure.
I work with a number of community advisory boards, and when you said 5 minutes at the beginning and 5 minutes at the end, I thought, how is that possible? We have groups of 10 to 12, and it's generally a minute a person if we're moving along. Our meetings are 90 minutes. I'm wondering whether you've ever thought of having business meetings separated from like a half-hour social gathering where people can actually just share and talk about their own health and their own families. Have you ever done that? And is that a plan that you think has value?
Rebecca, you can, jump in, but we have done that with the Lieberman Bureau. We don't always have researchers, so it's depended. Each board has been a little different. With the Lieberman Bureau, for example, and also the Virtual Senior Center, they want to meet every time, whether or not we have a visiting researcher. So sometimes we will dedicate more time to checking in and seeing how people are doing. So 5 minutes, was sort of a round number, and absolutely. Our group is a little smaller. It's usually 8 people tops. But absolutely some groups though really just wanted to stick to the research and say we only want to meet if there's a visiting researcher, and so they were less inclined to do that. So it really depends on the group and letting the group guide that a little bit. Yeah, Rebecca?
Yeah, and I would add that I want to emphasize every group kind of sets their own model. They decide when they want to meet, how long they want to meet. do they only want to meet with researchers? So for example, there is a group in a rural setting that they meet a lot already. They know each other. They're already socially, aware of each other. So they just only want to meet with the researcher, and they have like 2 meetings whenever there's a researcher. They have one to prepare ahead of time, or they may meet one-on-one with the facilitator, but they prepare, they look at the materials, they're ready, they have their discussion ideas, and then they meet with the researcher. So sometimes the social needs are different depending on the group. Just as a note, Hailee's group, I know we need to leave, Hailee's group does meet very regularly. So they also have, and not all groups do that. So it depends on how often they decide to meet.
Yeah, we meet bi-weekly, and again, whether there's a researcher presenting or not. So there have been sessions that I have maybe like an article prepared to share with them, but we don't even get to that because, they kind of decide they want to have more like a social time. I think they want to meet regularly because they are stay-at-home elders, and so this is one of their like really core regular opportunities for social interaction. So it becomes very important to them. But yeah, I think it's a great idea for some if it's taking up too much time to have certain like social events scheduled. I think it just depends on the bureau and its size and how, like Rebecca said, how they want it to run.
And of course, staff resources and the facilitators availability, that also plays into it as well. Okay.
Great, thank you for that question. It's just about 2 o'clock. I don't want to hold anyone over. I know Zoom fatigue is certainly real. Feel free to email me or any of the folks on the panel. I can forward the relevant question to them. And I'm really glad you are all here, and I hope we see you again in March. Thank you so much.